Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the committee for its report. I know it's quite a bit of work for the committee to go through this report, and I know my two honourable colleagues from the opposition have already spoken on a number of issues, and I don't intend to repeat them. As highlighted by Honourable Ranrondo, audit reports of this nature, Mr. Speaker, always highlight issues of vouchers, acquittals, things not done properly, approvals not given, timely reports are not presented. These are normal audit issues that we see year in, year out. And some ministries do better than the others. So, it's not surprising for us to see this. But my interest, Mr. Speaker, when we look at the role of the Auditor General and we look at the role of the Public Accounts Committee, is about how government expenditure is done, whether it is creating effectiveness and efficiency, whether the input, which is the expenditure, the output is not just annual reports, what has been done, inventory of who went where, how the civil servants did this and that, but it's also about the outcomes. I think there is a difference between the output and the outcomes, because the outcomes actually determine whether a particular expenditure created a desired impact. If it is to help a particular group, if it is to improve, government quotas or health facilities, whether the expenditure expended on those activities produce the desired outcome and the quality of the outcome. And that is why, as I highlighted yesterday, it is very, very important for the ministers, for the Parliament to look at that. And I know, Mr. Speaker, ministers actually look forward to these reports because it's a benchmark. Governments look forward to the Auditor General's report. The Prime Ministers look forward to the Auditor General's report because then they can actually assess what's happening in individual ministries, and ministers see these reports as a positive thing because they can also have an idea of what's going on in the ministry, because it's the permanent secretary which is in charge of the finances. So I would urge all of us, including the ministers, to see these reports and see the discussion on these reports as a positive thing, so that in the end we all achieve the objective of making sure that the expenditure is efficient and effective. Let me give you an example, Mr. Speaker. If you look at the budget for 2018-19, 2019-2020, and the last budget 2020-2021. In fact, for 2018-19 budget, the expenditure was almost 36% of the total GDP. For 2019 and 20, it was about 31% of the GDP. In 2020-2021, it was 36% of GDP. In many developing countries, that would be considered a very high percentage of government expenditure as a percent of GDP, Mr. Speaker. I am not against big governments. Big governments, big expenditure is sometimes required, Mr. Speaker, to ensure that we address the issues affecting the people, to address infrastructure issues. And there are reasons why size of the government goes up and down. But I think the question we need to ask is this the ideal size of the government that we are running? Whether the expenditure coming out of as a percent of GDP is producing the desired outcomes. My analysis, Mr. Speaker, and I think this is very important for the government to do, and maybe government to set up a commission to look at government expenditure over the last 3 or 4 or 5 budgets, to see the level of wastage, the level of ineffectiveness arising out of the total expenditure. My calculation, Mr. Speaker, from going through the audit reports in the past, looking at what has happened over the last 10, 15 years, and in the last 6 years that I've been in Parliament, and the budgets that have come into Parliament, my analysis shows that our wastage is somewhere between 15 to 20%, and in some ministries it could be more than 20%. But overall, it is somewhere between 15 to 20%. And I'll give you an example, Mr. Speaker, to explain why it is very important for us to look at that wastage, look at that inefficiency. For example, if you look at 2020-21 budget, the total expenditure budgeted is 3.6 billion out of a GDP of 9.9 billion. Now, if the wastage, Mr. Speaker, is 15% of the total 3.6 billion expenditure, then it amounts to about $540 million a year. If you put that together, if you say that 15% of 3.6 billion that is going to be spent in the financial year 2020-2021 is 15%, that means $540 million of taxpayers' fund is being wasted. Imagine, what we could do with that 540 million. How many free kidney dialysis we could provide. How much free medicine we could, how many more students we could send to tertiary education. These are issues that affect, that tell us why the public accounts, why the Auditor General's report, why we as members of Parliament, the ministers in government need to be very, very careful. Let's say if it was 20%, Mr. Speaker. Let's say that the wastage was 20% of the total expenditure. It would amount to, out of a $3.6 billion, $720 million a year. Now that's a lot of money. A lot of money, Mr. Speaker, in terms of the size of the country, the capacity of the economy to generate the revenue. And so I think it is very important. I think, as I said, and I want to repeat this, my calculation shows, or my estimate shows, that we are wasting about 15 to 20% of the total expenditure allocated in the budget. And I would therefore propose to the government, I know this is not something which is political. This is about managing our finances for our people, for our taxpayers, and it is the responsibility of this Parliament, which is the people's Parliament. We are responsible to the people to actually have a commission of inquiry, a study to find out the level of wastage that happens in government and why. And maybe the Auditor General could do a special study itself. I'm not saying we should have a parliamentary committee. The Auditor General should be provided funding to do that, to look at, hire people who can look at the wastages in government. And that, Mr. Speaker, I know the chairman of the Public Accounts Committee is smiling, or I don't know why, maybe, you like the idea of the Auditor General actually doing that study. But I can't labor that anymore, Mr. Speaker, the importance of knowing where the leakages are, where the wastages are. And as I said, the Auditor General sometimes looks at the sample. Those who understand, audits. The Auditor General doesn't look at every transaction. No auditor looks at every transaction for any organization. They don't look at individual, it's a sample of what they get from the information that is supplied by the ministries, and on the basis of that, they form an audit opinion, and on the basis of that audit opinion, they make recommendations to the government, and this is what the Auditor General has done. But for us to get further than that, we need special audits, or we need special studies, Mr. Speaker, for us to look at where and how the wastages can be stopped. I looked at the recommendations. There's one recommendation, recommendation 4, Honourable Chairman, which you highlighted, which was highlighted by the Honourable Chairman, Mr. Speaker, and that is to ensure that all capital projects are properly planned and adequate arrangements are made to implement the projects as quickly as possible when funds are provided. I highlighted that yesterday with respect to the FRA, with respect to other statutory organizations. I think a lot of the wastage can take place in projects, in capital projects. I mean, I highlighted in this parliament, about the FNU project, which the government provided grants to build a campus in Lautoka. I also look at the recommendation where we are saying that the ministries and departments must ensure succession plan, but also outsourcing technical work to consultants. Consultants, invariably, Mr. Speaker, are not necessarily bad. You need, ministries need consultants at times, you need technical expertise, but you need to build some of those capacities within the ministry. For example, when we talked about the shortage of drugs in hospitals, and I said, we need to look at the logistics. Is there a logistics person, a qualified logistics person within the unit that looks after pharmaceutical? Whether we need a consultant. Sometimes we spend more money on consultants, on outsourcing, and there's a lot of evidence, Mr. Speaker, about outsourcing, about not maintaining government assets, for example. Renting properties outside of government and paying rents. These can create wastage because there is an invariable thinking that governments have a lot of money and then they can do that. So they can pay a higher rent. I mean, I look at the government buildings around the country. It is probably one of the worst state I've ever seen, Mr. Speaker. Government quarters, whether it's a government school, whether it's hospital. I went to Sub-Savu Hospital. At least Sub-Savu Hospital from outside was better than when you go to CWM. Now, this is what I'm saying, Mr. Speaker, that when we look at capital expenditure, and I think the committee has rightfully picked that up, that you need to do a proper assessment. So that recommendation, where it seems that a lot of ministries it's easy for civil servants sometimes to say, all right, we need outside. There are situations where you need that, where you need consultants to do the report, to pinpoint, through a particular study, what is happening. But some of those need to be built in within the civil service. And I know, Mr. Speaker, you would know very well yourself, that the planning office, the National Planning Office, was one of the most important offices in any country. I know in other countries, in some of the Asian NICs, the successful Asian countries, the planning office was where the government ensured they would send people to go and get the best degree from the best university around the world and come and work in the planning office. You look at South Korea, you look at Singapore, you look at Thailand, you look at Malaysia, you look at other successful countries where the planning was the most important part of what, because that informed government, that informed ministers, that informed policy making based on evidence, based on hard evidence, so that there is no wastage of expenditure. So, Mr. Speaker, my final recommendation, my final recommendation would be or meaning, it will have no impact, it will not lead to the improvement in the final outcome, which is creating value for money and giving the best to our people. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I thank the Honourable Beman Prasad. I now give the floor to the Minister, Ifremi Wanganbete. You have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you, Honourable Speaker. Honourable Speaker, I would like to thank the committee for this very comprehensive report, and I found it